When steel bends, walls break, and even homes collapse, the wild shows no mercy. From a grizzly destroying a $300,000 hunter truck in Russia to a bear breaking into a police outpost in Alaska, nowhere is safe. Whether on a football field in Montana, a cabin in the Smoky Mountains, vineyards in Eastern Europe, or the ice of the Arctic, predators strike without warning. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling bear attacks that prove survival against nature is never guaranteed. August 7, 2025, dawned hot and oppressive in the remote wilderness of the Amur region, where the air carried the weight of midsummer heat and the scent of pine hung heavy beneath a glaring sky. 4 companions had set out that morning on what they assumed would be nothing more than another routine hunting trip. They had planned carefully, driving deep into a rugged river valley with confidence born of preparation. Their journey was made in a specially built off-road truck, a machine reinforced with heavy steel plating and fitted with compartments for rifles, supplies, and provisions. Valued at nearly $300,000, it stood as a symbol of pride, security, and power in the unforgiving terrain. The men, Viktor Smirnov, Artem Kolesnikov, Daniel Orlov, and Lev Baranov, believed themselves equipped for any challenge. They carried rifles, blades, food, tents, and enough gear to last for days in the field. The clearing where they parked seemed quiet, the sun cutting harshly through the tall trees and shadows stretching like long fingers across the gravel. Yet clinging faintly to their equipment was the smell of fresh elk meat from an earlier kill, its sharp metallic tang hanging in the warm air. What they did not realize was that the odor had carried farther than they imagined, drifting beyond the tree line to stir the hunger of a predator larger and more violent than any they had accounted for. From the shade of the forest, a massive grizzly emerged, its size dwarfing the forms of men and machines. Dust streaked its fur, and damp mud still clung to its legs from the riverbank. With the heavy, deliberate steps of a beast honed by hunger, it advanced, closing the distance without hesitation. In moments, the clearing shifted from stillness to chaos. The bear struck first with devastating force, ramming into the side of the armored truck. The impact was so violent that the reinforced frame shook like thin tin. Windows exploded outward in showers of jagged glass, and the carefully stocked coolers split open. Food scattered across the dirt, gear tumbled free, and metal shrieked as claws raked across steel. The sounds of destruction filled the air, twisting, snapping, shattering, a chorus of ruin delivered by raw power. Victor, standing closest to the tailgate, had no time to escape. The predator lunged, its enormous paw striking across his chest and neck. The blow carved deep wounds, pinning him against the mangled frame of the truck bed. He collapsed beneath the weight of the strike, the ground darkening beneath him. Artem and Daniel scrambled to react, rifles half raised, but the speed of the grizzly made their efforts meaningless. In the next heartbeat, the beast was upon them, its strength breaking through their defense with a fury that could not be stopped. Both men fell in seconds, their bodies torn by the relentless assault. The valley echoed with their cries and then with silence. Lev alone survived the first rush, hurled backward by the shock of impact. His body struck a fallen log, the jolt forcing air from his lungs. Splinters cut into his arms as he scrambled behind the heavy wood, ribs burning with every breath. The bear raged through the camp, spinning and tearing, snapping its jaws as it shredded whatever stood in its path. Crates cracked open, tents ripped apart, and sparks burst as steel scraped against rock. The expensive truck, once their fortress on wheels, was reduced in minutes to a wreck of twisted plating and broken glass. Its proud form crumpled into ruin. The rampage stretched on, each moment carrying the weight of a nightmare that refused to end. The clearing shook with roars, and with the thunder of the animal slamming through every obstacle. Rifles were tossed aside like splinters. Coolers, tents, and crates were flattened, shredded, or flung into the trees. Each crash, each tearing sound, marked another piece of their world destroyed. Only after the violence had reached its height did the beast finally turn, with a final roar echoing against the cliffs. The grizzly disappeared back into the dark tree line, its body swallowed by the forest as quickly as it had appeared. Silence followed, heavy and unnatural. The only sound left was the ragged breath of Lev. He crouched low, trembling, his skin marked by bruises and blood. Before him lay the wreck of the truck, the torn remnants of their camp, and the still shapes of his companions. The wilderness had revealed its true, merciless face. Survival had come to him alone, but the cost was written everywhere around him, in shattered steel, in torn earth, and in the bodies of those who had stood beside him. He rose unsteadily, forcing himself from behind the log, each step carrying pain from bruised ribs and battered muscles. The devastation loomed in every direction. The ruined truck no longer looked like a machine of strength. Its frame lay cracked, twisted as though made of brittle bone. Rifles were broken, coolers upturned, food trampled into the dirt, and tents reduced to scraps of fabric fluttering weakly in the breeze. The clearing had become a graveyard in moments, transformed by a force no human could halt. Hours passed before help reached the valley. The sharp cracks of gunfire, faintly heard earlier in the day, had drawn concern from nearby settlers who dispatched a search party. Following the broken trail of branches and claw marks carved into trees, they reached the clearing at last. There they found Lev curled near the ruined truck, his hands shaking, his face pale with shock. Rescuers worked swiftly to bind his wounds and lift him onto a stretcher. Others moved quietly to cover the fallen. The truck, assessed in silence, was deemed beyond repair, a monument of steel twisted into failure by a single animal's rage. Lev was carried back to safety and treated for cracked ribs, torn skin, and shock. Though his physical injuries slowly began to heal, the deeper wounds remained. Sleep offered no peace. He woke often in the dark, heart racing at imagined claws tearing metal or the sound of roars echoing through memory. The neighbors who came to see him listened with quiet gravity as he described what had unfolded, the unstoppable strength, the speed, and the suddenness with which the bear had reduced everything they had to nothing. His account spread quickly, retold by others who carried it from settlement to settlement. The story weighted with both fear and grim fascination. Officials visited the site in the weeks that followed, marking claw scars on trees and noting the wreckage. Warnings were issued across the region, urging hunters to secure kills carefully and never to leave fresh meat near camp. Residents were reminded that apex predators had ruled this land long before human presence, and they continued to rule it still. For Lev, those warnings were not instructions, but truths engraved permanently into his life. The wilderness had shown its supremacy, and he had been left to carry the burden of remembering. His survival came not with triumph, but with silence, grief, and the memory of 3 companions lost to a rampage that no preparation could have prevented. June of 2025 settled warm and bright across the rugged coast of Alaska, where dense forests pressed against the edges of human settlement and the salt air carried the tang of the nearby sea. On the outskirts of a small coastal town stood the police station, a modest building of brick and concrete designed to serve the community and withstand the harsh weather of the region. Inside, officers went about their daily routines. They filled out paperwork, checked equipment, and shared brief exchanges in the quiet of the afternoon, entirely unaware that trouble was already making its way toward them through the tree line. From the shadows of the forest, a massive bear stirred. This particular animal, heavy and restless, had likely been drawn into the area by the pungent sense of food waste and unsecured trash. Near the back of the station, piles of refuse and scraps had been left improperly sealed, and the wind carried the smell far across the woods. For a creature with a nose hundreds of times more sensitive than a human's, it was an irresistible signal. With slow, deliberate steps, the bear emerged from the brush, its thick coat brushing branches aside as it advanced steadily toward the building. The animal reached the side door of the station, snout twitching as it pressed against the metal frame. Though built to resist weather, the entrance had never been intended to withstand the push of a full-grown bear. Hinges groaned in protest as the beast shoved forward, and the door swung wide as though it offered no resistance at all. Inside, the sudden noise shattered the stillness. Papers flew from desks, boots struck the floorboards in a clatter of alarm, and voices rose in confusion. Down the narrow hallway, claws scraped against tiles in a chilling echo. Lockers rattled when the animal's weight brushed them, and one door swung open, spilling belongings onto the ground. The predator's nose buried itself in storage crates near the evidence room, tearing open boxes and scattering containers with shocking ease. Officers rushed toward the disturbance, but their first glimpse of the intruder stalled their steps. Few sights could compare to the size and presence of a full-grown coastal bear standing inside the confines of their workplace. For a moment, disbelief rooted them in place. Then instinct returned, and the nearest officer attempted to divert the animal. Sergeant Daniel Hayes stepped forward, raising his arms wide in an effort to guide the beast away from the main offices. The bear turned sharply at the movement, lowering its massive head. Its dark eyes caught the light in a stare that carried both caution and threat. Without warning, one massive paw swung outward. The strike caught Hayes across the arm with brutal force, tearing through his sleeve and leaving long gashes that spilled blood. The blow knocked him backward, sending pain coursing down his side as he tried to regain his footing. His colleagues reacted instantly, some pulling him clear while others scrambled to create distance. The bear pressed further into the station, smashing another locker door, sending metal clanging onto the floor and overturning furniture in its path. The sharp sounds of resistance filled the building. Officers struck cabinets with batons, slammed chairs against the ground, and shouted in unison, desperate to drive the animal back. Their combined noise created a wall of confusion that pressed against the predator's instincts. For long, tense minutes, the standoff continued. The bear growled deeply, each breath fogging the air before its muzzle. It pawed at bags and dug through broken boxes, searching for the source of the scent that had drawn it inside. The men held their ground at a distance, prepared to retreat if the beast charged again. Every second felt stretched thin with risk, each movement weighted with the possibility of disaster. Finally, the balance shifted. Startled by the loud echo of clanging metal and the steady pounding of boots, the bear hesitated, its massive frame twisted toward the open doorway. Claws scraped across tile once more as it lumbered back outside. With a final grunt, the predator slipped into the tree line and vanished into the depths of the forest as quickly as it had appeared. What remained in its wake was silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of Hayes and the faint crackle of broken fixtures. Blood dotted the floor where he had been struck, and the once orderly station now stood in disarray. Lockers were bent, boxes torn open, and claw marks scored deep into the walls and flooring. The air carried the mixed sense of overturned trash, spilled evidence, and the metallic tang of blood. Even with the bear gone, the officers knew their sense of safety had been shaken. The intrusion had proven how thin the line was between human spaces and the wilderness surrounding them. Medical help arrived within minutes, rushing Hayes to treatment. His arm was cleaned, stitched, and bound, though dark bruising had already spread beneath his skin. Doctors explained that luck had spared him far worse, for the strike could easily have shattered bone or torn tendons beyond repair. Though his recovery would take weeks, his life was secure. Back at the station, the rest of the team walked carefully among the wreckage. Each scar on the floor, each broken locker, and each claw-marked wall reminded them of the reality they had faced. The presence of one animal had been enough to undo their sense of control, and to remind them of the untamed force just beyond their doors. Officials opened an inspection before the day ended, photographing the damage and logging the bear's path. They noted the unsecured trash bins and food storage, recognizing them as the likely cause of the intrusion. Wildlife rangers were quick to point out that in a state defined by its wilderness, human negligence could create dangerous encounters within moments. Prevention, they warned, mattered as much as any response. News of the event spread rapidly through the community. Residents expressed fear and disbelief that a predator of such size had walked into a police building in broad daylight. Community meetings followed, where town leaders pledged stricter enforcement of waste management, reinforced storage for public facilities, and stronger barriers around key buildings. The event, while frightening, became a catalyst for needed change. For Sergeant Hayes, recovery brought time for reflection. His scars became lasting reminders of how thin the boundary between civilization and wilderness could be. Though no lives were lost, the marks on his body and on the walls of the station told a story that would not be easily forgotten. In a land where forests stretched endlessly and predators reigned without concern for human boundaries, even places built for order and safety could be breached. The incident underscored a truth that every Alaskan resident already knew, but now felt with greater clarity. The wild would always remain stronger than locks, walls, or rules. June of 2025 opened with a warm evening in a quiet town in Montana, where families gathered along the edges of the local football field. The summer sun dipped low behind the pine-covered hills, stretching long shadows over the dusty ground, while children laughed and raced across the open space. The ball skittered back and forth in play, and the sidelines were lined with water bottles, sneakers, and backpacks. Parents and neighbors leaned against the fence or sat in folding chairs, talking easily with one another and cheering as the game went on. The scene carried the familiar calm of small-town life, filled with the safety of routine, with no hint of what was about to emerge from the forest that bordered the field. Without warning, the sound of breaking branches tore through the calm. The sharp cracks drew every eye toward the tree line just as a massive bear burst from the woods. Its roar shattered the laughter in an instant, deep and thunderous, rolling across the field like a storm. The ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight as its paws struck the earth in pounding rhythm, dust and grass scattering with every step of its charge. Children shrieked and scattered in all directions. The game abandoned in seconds. Yet one boy, 12-year-old Ethan Clark, froze in place, locked in shock at the sight of the predator closing fast. In only a heartbeat, the animal closed the distance. With a sudden swing, its paw struck Ethan with brutal force, sending him tumbling across the ground. Sharp claws ripped into his arms and legs, shredding his clothes and leaving red streaks across the soil. His cries of pain were lost beneath the animal's roar. Panic spread through the field like fire. Children sprinted blindly, slipping on the dry earth as shouts filled the air. The football rolled away, forgotten, while jackets, bottles, and shoes were flung aside in the desperate rush to escape. Parents ran forward, their hearts pounding with fear, grabbing at the nearest children and pushing them toward safety. Others, with no weapons but raw determination, armed themselves with sticks, rocks, or anything within reach. Together they formed a shaky line, yelling, waving, and throwing what they could to keep the predator's attention fixed away from the boy on the ground. Ethan, gasping and pale, tried to crawl to safety. Long claw marks lined his arms and legs, staining the dust beneath him. With shaking hands, he dragged himself inch by inch toward the base of the goalpost, pulling forward on instinct alone. His body trembled from pain and fear, yet he kept moving, knowing that stopping could mean the end. Behind him, neighbors raised a storm of noise, shouting, stamping, and blowing whistles, each sound a desperate effort to build a wall of defiance against the predator that loomed near the goal line. The bear hesitated, its growl rumbling through the fading light. Dust swirled with each heavy step as it slashed the ground in warning, shaking the earth beneath its weight. But the persistence of the crowd, the whistles, the cries, the raised arms, formed a barrier it did not wish to cross. With a final snarl and a huffing exhale, the animal turned. Its massive shoulders shifted as it wheeled back toward the forest, crashing into the tree line and vanishing once more into the cover of shadow. Silence fell over the field. Only sobs of frightened children and the gasps of exhausted adults filled the space where laughter had once echoed. On the ground, Ethan lay trembling, his body cut and bloodied but alive. Around him, scattered belongings and claw marks painted a picture of wild strength that would not fade quickly. The football field, once a symbol of safety and play, now bore scars of wilderness breaking through the boundaries of town life. Parents and neighbors carried Ethan away from the torn ground. His arms and legs were marked with long wounds that bled heavily, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The game that had filled the evening with joy was now reduced to a memory scattered across marked soil, broken shoes, and torn shirts. Every step toward the road felt urgent as neighbors hurried him toward help. Others gathered the remaining children, guiding them gently but firmly away from the ruined field. By the time the first responders arrived, chaos still lingered in the air. A football sat half buried in dust, crushed bottles and trampled bags lay scattered, and claw marks scored deep into the metal posts of the goal. The medical team moved quickly, lifting Ethan onto a stretcher and binding his wounds. They wrapped him in blankets to fight shock before rushing him into the waiting ambulance. Sirens wailed as the vehicle pulled away, lights flashing across the small town and echoing against the pines. Neighbors gathered along the roadside, their faces pale, watching in silence as the boy was carried away. At the hospital, doctors worked through the night to treat his injuries. Stitches ran long across his arms and legs where the claws had cut deepest. Though recovery would take weeks of rest and careful treatment, Ethan had survived. Relief spread through the town as word reached families and friends. Parents spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen, about the speed of the attack and the helplessness they felt standing before a predator that seemed unstoppable. In the days that followed, officials and wildlife experts arrived to study the site. They traced the tracks back into the forest and determined the bear had likely been drawn by food left near the edge of the woods. The incident was explained not as random, but as the direct result of human carelessness. Residents were urged to secure trash, store feed properly, and recognize that living so close to wilderness carried responsibilities as well as risks. Meetings were held, where rangers and hunters alike emphasized the growing pressures of shrinking wild ranges, pushing predators closer to human settlements. For the Clark family, the ordeal reshaped their daily lives. Ethan's scars, both visible and unseen, would remain long after the wounds closed. The football field itself stood abandoned for weeks, its surface scarred by claw marks and marked by the memory of that evening. Children no longer rushed to play there, their trust in the space shaken. Slowly, with time, the community began to gather again, but the memory lingered. The June evening that had begun in laughter had ended in terror, a reminder whispered to every child and parent alike. The wilderness was never far, and even the safest places could be claimed in an instant by forces far stronger than any fence or field could hold back. April 2023 settled calm over a mountain range in the southeast as the Harper family sat down for dinner in their wooden cabin. The air outside was cool, the fading light spilling through tall trees, while inside the sound of forks and pans echoed in the small kitchen. But the quiet was suddenly broken by heavy scratching along the back door, each thud shaking the walls. At first they assumed it was the wind or perhaps an animal nosing around the porch, but the noise grew louder until the railing cracked under a crushing weight. A large black bear pushed against the wood, forcing its way forward with sheer strength. The door burst open, hinges squealing as the animal shoved through, sending splinters flying across the room. The beast stood tall in the frame, its dark coat shining under the dim light, its nose flaring at the smell of cooked food. Pots rattled, cupboards shook, and in seconds the peaceful kitchen turned into chaos. The bear stormed inside, knocking over chairs as claws scraped across the floorboards. It reared, pawing at shelves, tossing pans and scattering plates that shattered on the ground. The crash of falling dishes and the heavy growl filled every corner of the house, drowning out the sound of human cries. Lucas grabbed the nearest object, a chair, and tried to hold it up between himself and the charging weight. The bear swiped hard, claws tearing into his arm and shoulder, ripping fabric and skin. He fell back with a cry, the chair broken into pieces under the force. Pain seared through his body as blood spread quickly across his sleeve, the shock leaving him gasping on the floor. The predator roared, snapping its jaws as it advanced, its teeth glinting as if ready to strike again. Diane's instincts took over as she snatched a pan from the counter and slammed it against the surface with all her strength. The sound echoed like metal against stone, drawing the animal's attention away from her son for a moment. The bear spun wildly, knocking a table over, its legs splintering as plates and cups crashed onto the floor. Each swipe left deep marks in the wood, claw tracks etched like scars into the home. Diane raised the pan again, striking the counter with a force that sent sparks leaping. Outside, a dog barked fiercely, its sharp cries piercing the night. The sudden noise broke the beast's focus. It turned sharply toward the open door, huffing as it backed away, its paws leaving bloody prints from where it had swiped Lucas. The commotion, the noise, and the canine growls proved too much. With a final roar, the animal pushed through the broken frame, scattering more debris as it retreated into the dark forest. Inside the cabin, the wreckage told the story of what had just taken place. Blood streaked the wooden floor. Furniture lay shattered, and the kitchen was a ruin of twisted pans and broken dishes. Lucas clutched his wounded arm, his face pale, while his mother held him tight, both trembling. The night had shown them a truth they would never forget. In the wilderness, the line between home and untamed land was thinner than they had ever imagined. The cabin lay broken and quiet after the animal's retreat, but the danger had only changed its form. Lucas leaned against his mother, blood dripping steadily from the deep cuts along his arm and shoulder. Each throb of pain reminded them of how close the swipes had come to being fatal. Diane tore cloth from a curtain, binding the wounds as tightly as she could. Her hands shook as she worked, but she forced herself to stay calm, knowing that if the bleeding did not slow, her son's strength would fade before help arrived. The room itself looked more like the aftermath of a storm than a home. Chairs were splintered, dishes shattered, and claw marks ripped through the walls. The air smelled of iron and smoke, mixed with the musky scent the bear had left behind. Every creak in the wood or gust of wind from outside made them tense, afraid that the creature might circle back. They knew the forest held countless shadows, and any sound could be the heavy tread of paws returning to finish what had begun. Diane guided Lucas into the front room away from the wreckage, laying him against a couch that had survived the chaos. She wrapped another layer of cloth around his arm, pressing hard against the flow of blood. His breathing steadied little by little, though each movement drew a grimace of pain. The seconds stretched long, broken only by the barking of the neighbor's dog, still sounding off in the distance. That noise was both a comfort and a warning, proof that the wild was close at hand, and never far from breaking through. Hours later, headlights cut across the trees outside. Their neighbor, drawn by the noise and his dog's alarm, stepped into the wrecked cabin and saw the mess left behind. He moved quickly, helping Diane lift Lucas onto a blanket before rushing him toward town in his truck. The journey was rough, every bump along the mountain road making the boy groan, but it carried them away from the danger that had stalked their home. Doctors at a small clinic stitched the torn flesh, cleaned the wounds, and gave Lucas medicine to dull the pain. The gashes would leave scars, but they were not fatal. Diane sat close by his bed through the night, replaying the chaos again and again, her heart pounding each time she remembered the sound of claws on wood. In the days that followed, the cabin was patched, though the deep claw marks across the walls were never fully erased. Wildlife officials visited, warning about the need to secure food and clean up scents that might draw predators close. For Lucas and his mother, the lesson was burned into memory more deeply than any warning could give. Even in a quiet home with doors closed and lights glowing, the forest's power could break through in seconds, leaving behind scars that would last a lifetime. September 2024 opened with cool winds rolling across the remote valleys of Transylvania, where fields of vineyards stretched in neat rows. Workers moved busily among the trellises, their hands stained with juice as they filled crates with ripe, heavy grapes. The smell of crushed fruit clung to the air, sweet and thick, drifting into the surrounding hills. Wagons creaked under the weight of the harvest, and laughter rose from the crew as they passed full baskets toward the waiting truck. It was a season meant for reward after long months of tending vines, but the land carried more than grapes. The edge of the forest hid shadows, and one of them was moving closer with terrible purpose. The first sign of danger came as leaves shook violently near the timberline. A massive brown bear stepped from the brush, its coat dark and thick, its nose lifting toward the scent of the harvest. For a moment the workers froze, the quiet air broken only by the rustle of vines. Then, without pause, the beast surged forward. Wooden posts snapped like sticks under its weight as it plowed through the trellises. Grapes exploded under its paws, scattering across the dirt like spilled jewels. A row of barrels collapsed, the wood shattering as the animal drove straight through. The vineyard, once calm and filled with chatter, erupted into chaos. Men shouted and scrambled, dropping baskets, as the bear advanced deeper into the rows. One farmhand, Andrei Popescu, tried to scramble up a ladder leaning against a trellis, desperate to escape upward. The bear reared high, its paw sweeping through the air. Cloth tore and blood splattered as its claws ripped across his back, cutting deep and sending him crashing to the ground. His cries echoed as grapes tumbled around him, the harvest staining the earth red where it mixed with his blood. Panic spread through the crew as others rushed toward tools and barrels, clanging metal against wood in a desperate attempt to drive the predator back. The sound of banging filled the air, but the bear's fury was not easily swayed. It tore through another row, scattering leaves and stems across the field. Workers stumbled over crates in their hurry to retreat, some falling, others clutching shovels and pitchforks as weapons that looked far too small against such size. Finally, the wall of noise grew too loud. The bear paused, its massive head swinging toward the shouting group. The clamor of iron against wood, the cries of frightened men, and the sharp edge of human defiance finally broke its charge. With a guttural growl, the animal turned, crushing another row of vines as it lumbered back toward the misty forest. Its shape melted into the trees as suddenly as it had come, leaving the vineyard broken and the crew bruised and scattered across the field. Andrei lay clutching his torn back, his breath ragged, as co-workers gathered around him. The truck still sat half-loaded, grapes strewn across the dirt, barrels splintered and tools scattered. The harvest was no longer just a season of work and reward. That evening, among broken trellises and bloodied hands, the vineyard had been turned into a battlefield, a place where survival overshadowed celebration, and where the wild had reminded everyone that it still ruled the edges of their land. The vineyard was silent after the roar faded, yet fear and pain clung to every corner. Andrei lay supported by his co-workers, his torn back bound hastily with cloth cut from shirts. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage, staining the ground already littered with crushed grapes and splintered wood. His face was pale, his body trembling from the shock, but he remained alive, breathing shallowly against the weight of injury. Around him, others stood frozen, shaken by how quickly the day of labor had turned into chaos. The vineyard itself bore the marks of the intruder. Long claw streaks ripped across trellis beams, vines lay mangled, and crates of fruit were smashed into the soil. Wooden barrels sat broken, their staves scattered in twisted heaps. The truck, half loaded with the harvest, leaned with boxes spilled around its tires, the sweet scent of grapes still thick in the air. Workers looked across the wreckage, seeing not just lost produce, but the reminder of how easily power from the wild could tear through human order. Neighbors soon rushed in from nearby farms, carrying lanterns and tools as news spread quickly. They found the men bruised, clothes torn, and spirits shaken. Andrei was lifted carefully onto a cart, The path back to the village lit by flickering flames of carried torches. Each bump in the trail made him groan with pain, the cuts along his back deep and raw. At the village, elders gathered, bringing water, cloth, and herbs to slow the bleeding until a doctor could arrive. Though his wounds were grave, his survival was seen as a sign of resilience against odds that had nearly turned fatal. In the following days, the vineyard became a site of repair. Workers replaced posts, tied new lines for vines, and gathered grapes left scattered in the dirt. Yet claw marks and broken beams remained as visible scars, reminders of what had come from the forest edge. The harvest continued, but each creak of branches or distant sound in the hills made hands tighten around tools, eyes darting toward the tree line. The beauty of the countryside now carried an edge of caution, and the joy of gathering fruit had been replaced with wariness. The event spread across nearby towns, stirring debate. Some spoke of the dangers of leaving farmland so close to wild hills without stronger barriers. Others saw it as a lesson that no field, however cultivated, was safe from nature's claim. For André, recovery stretched slowly. His back bore stitched wounds that would scar for life, reminders carved into flesh of the day when grapes turned to blood and a vineyard became a battlefield. March 2022 began with a pale sky stretched over the frozen expanse of Svalbard, where ice floes drifted slowly under the roar of helicopter blades. Researcher Eric Lindstrom was mid-survey, scanning the endless white for seals and bears that shaped the fragile balance of the region. The small aircraft hovered low above the jagged surface, the air thin and bitterly cold. Spotting a giant predator moving along the ice, Eric motioned for a closer look. The machine lowered, skids touching down against the frozen crust. What had been meant as a short stop for observation quickly turned into a scene of danger none aboard expected. From the edge of the floe, the massive white predator turned, its black eyes catching the sudden presence of men and machine. The bear moved with a mix of caution and raw strength, paws crunching through frost as its attention shifted. In seconds, its curiosity twisted into aggression. The great body surged forward, muscles rippling, breath steaming like smoke across the ice. The stillness of the Arctic broke with thunder as the animal charged straight for the helicopter. Eric stepped out, rushing to secure equipment and samples before the wind of the rotors scattered them across the surface. But the predator closed the gap faster than he could react. With terrifying force, its paw struck the open side of the craft, slamming against Eric's chest and crushing him against the frame. Pain exploded through his body as he gasped, pinned hard by claws that raked deep across his side. The pilot tried to lift, tilting the aircraft into the air, but the beast was relentless, its jaws clamping onto Eric's shoulder, tearing flesh and fabric in one violent grip. The struggle on the ice turned into chaos. The rotor wash blasted snow into a storm of white, but the gusts only whipped around the beast, doing nothing to drive it back. Gear was yanked from the aircraft as the predator clawed at cables and supplies. Eric fought desperately, his body breaking under the sheer weight of the attack. Each snap of its jaws shook him violently, the helicopter shuddering under the strain of beast against machine. The pilot, fighting controls, pulled the craft higher, but the predator held long enough to leave deep destruction. Wires hung loose, samples spilled across the floe, and Eric's body slumped in torn harness straps. Finally, the bear released, its head lifting as if satisfied, before turning back toward the endless horizon. With heavy strides, it vanished into the fog, leaving behind silence broken only by the weak beat of blades straining overhead. On the ice below, Eric lay gravely wounded, his blood stark against the blue-white of the frozen world. The marks of the predator's fury were carved into metal and flesh alike, proof that even the sky offered no escape when wild strength met human presence. March 2022 in the frozen archipelago of Svalbard ended not with silence, but with tragedy. As the giant predator vanished into the white haze, the small helicopter strained to rise, its rotor blades struggling under loose cables and bent panels. The aircraft barely steadied above the jagged ice, shuddering with damage that made each second in the air uncertain. Inside, Eric Lindstrom lay slumped, his clothing soaked, chest torn by claws and shoulder crushed by jaws that had clamped like iron. The pilot kept control, eyes fixed on distant ridges, trying to carry what was left of the mission away from danger. The Arctic below stretched endless, cold, and indifferent. Red stains on the ice marked where the predator had struck. A scene of violence frozen into the landscape. The helicopter drifted toward a small base camp farther along the floe, where researchers hurried out, alerted by radio calls. When they saw the broken aircraft lowering unsteadily, they rushed forward. their boots sinking deep into snow as the machine touched down hard against the surface. The crew scrambled to pull Eric from the cabin, laying him flat on the frozen ground. His breaths were shallow, his skin pale, and each wound showed the force no man could withstand. Despite quick hands and urgent effort, the truth was clear. The Arctic cold slowed blood, but the damage was too severe. Within minutes, the fight for life ended, leaving only silence broken by the wail of wind sweeping across the floes. Around the team, the ice seemed endless, its stillness magnified by the weight of sudden loss. The polar wilderness had claimed another life, not with storm or freezing seas, but with the power of its greatest hunter. Hours later, emergency flights arrived, guiding the broken machine back toward Longyearbyen. The news spread quickly, striking shock through research circles. Scientists spoke of Eric's work, his years dedicated to studying wildlife in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Yet alongside respect came warnings, echoed by officials who reviewed every detail of the encounter. They noted how close observation had turned into disaster, how a landing meant for study became an open door for risk. Back in Norway, his passing was mourned widely. Communities reflected on the balance between science and survival in such unforgiving places. The attack sparked debate over safety rules, over whether landing near apex predators could ever be justified. For Eric's colleagues, the memory of that day was not only about loss, but also about a reminder written in scars across metal and ice. The white landscape of Svalbard looked unchanged after the bear vanished, yet for those who saw the attack, the Arctic would never again appear silent or safe.